Hello, hello. This is Seth Parnell, the minister of the Portia Church of Christ, and this is episode 171 of the Midweek Bible Study. Hope that you are doing good. Hope you're doing well. We appreciate you being here, whether you're watching now or later on. We hope you know that we love having you here, and we appreciate your willingness in order to study the Word of God. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Hope you had a good time with your family last week. We didn't have an episode last week because we were celebrating Thanksgiving as well. It's always a good time to get together with family and to, catch up and just spend some good quality time with each other. And so, hope you had a wonderful week, last week, and I hope everything was good to you. We, as we always do, we want to give you an invitation. If you're someone who is in the local area, then we invite you to come join us at the Portia Church of Christ. We are meeting at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock for Sunday morning, 5 o'clock for Sunday night, and 6 o'clock for Wednesday night. And so if you're in the area for any of those times, we invite you to come see us. We would love to have you with us. We'd love to hear from you and be able to worship with you and talk to you. And we always enjoy having visitors over there. And so hope that you can take advantage of that opportunity. Right now, we're studying some attributes of God. We're studying about the Godhead on Sunday morning, and we're fixing to start studying about Esther, I believe, for Sunday morning class. And then Sunday night we are going through the book of Acts, and we're in Acts chapter 7, which is the story of Stephen, and we're going over Stephen's sermon and the kind of the history that he goes back and how he how he's someone who is put in an almost impossible situation, but yet with eloquence and with wisdom, he gives this great defense of his work, and he does that, and it's a really great chapter to read. It's a long chapter, but it's a great one to read, and so that's what we're studying right now on Wednesday. And so if you're in the area, come study with us. We'd love to have you. But and also, like as we always say, if there's anything, if there's any suggestions, or if there's any put your 2 cents in, please feel free to do that. Or if you have any suggestions for future episodes, let us know. And a couple of weeks, we're gonna have kind of like a year-end review type of episode. And so if you have any anything special you've been studying on, or if you've had or in your opinion, what have been some of the biggest things that the church has faced throughout the year, let me know that, and we might talk about it. We might go through some of those things. And so that's what we're going to be doing in a couple weeks, maybe, I think. And as we move into December, wow, it's the last day of November. That's crazy to think about that, how the year is just jetted by. And now we're in December, and we only got 1 month left before 2023 is in the rearview mirror. And that's, like I said, that's pretty astounding when you think back. But time moves pretty quickly. But here tonight, we're going to take a brief look at Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. As we usually do with these shorter sessions, we're not going to take an exhaustive look of this chapter, because this is something that you can preach on. This is something that you can preach a pretty in-depth sermon on, about the sacrifice of Isaac. But we're going to just kind of touch on a few things that we have here in the story, so that we can have some things to kind of mull over and chew on as we go throughout this week. But as you know, this takes place in a time, in a pretty joyful time of the life of Abraham. We're introduced to Abraham, way back, I believe, in chapter 12, and he is someone who's called by God to get up and to go to a land that he has, never seen before. So him and his wife, Sarah, at the time she was named Sarai, they get up and they go, and God leads them. And then they travel, and they trust completely in God as they continue to go throughout their journey. But they had one problem, and that was that eventually, as they were getting older and older, Sarah still didn't have a son, or she didn't have a child in the first place. And so they'd given up the fact that, they're just not going to have children. They're just not going to have, any offspring. Their line was going to end with them. They kind of tried to remedy with it, as, Sarah would give, Abraham her handmaid and to try to have children, through her. But that wasn't, God's plan. And so one day, Abraham is visited, by these figures and these angels, and he tells them, he says, when we come back here, next year, your wife Sarah will have a child, and she'll have, a baby. And of course, Sarah laughed, Abraham laughed. This was something that was unbelievable to them because they were up there. They were pretty old in age, and so having children was something that was out of the picture for them, they thought. But they were told, you're going to have, a child, and indeed, that's what happened. And Isaac, was born, and Isaac is going to be that line that traces back all the way from Abraham, and you can go all the way down to Jesus even. And with that line, of genealogies that traces, through that. And so the fact that Isaac is born here is a pretty big deal. It's good to see Jackie Henry. Hope you are doing well. Appreciate having you here. Hope that you've had a wonderful day. Always appreciate you stopping by here with us. But we and this, this is what makes this story even more, impactful. When you think about, all the things that Abraham and Sarah went through in order just to have that child. Now here in chapter 22, God is going to ask Abraham to do something that seems almost impossible. That seems like it's, the last thing that Abraham would ever do. Because if Abraham, said, if Abraham was faced with the situation, you have to give away all of your sheep, or you can give away, Isaac. Of course, he would take Isaac. I think at this point Abraham would have given up anything that he had, for his child, for his son. But God says, it's your son that I want you to take up and sacrifice. And so he says here in verse 1 of chapter 22, where he says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I should tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to the young man, stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And so we have the scene setting here. And a lot of times this, raises some questions about, the nature of God and about, some of the things that God can do. But I think it's important to look at, verse 1 as it says here, after these things, it says God tested, Abraham. This is not something, this is not something that God is kind of like legitimately, requesting of Abraham. But this is a test. God is testing Abraham. He is testing, the faith of Abraham, in this section. A lot of people, some people raise questions then about human sacrifice. Would human sacrifice ever be, pleasing to God? Would it ever be something that God would look favorably upon? But remember, this is a test. That God is not legitimately requesting of Abraham, in order to do this, but he's testing him to see, the strength, of his faith. And so he says, Abraham, and Abraham responds, here I am. He says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. And so you can kind of see with the wording, how this is a test. He says, take your son, your only son. And so you're taking your son, that's a That's a big part. That's a solid, punch to the stomach. But then it's your only son, the only son that you have. That's even more, grievous. And then he says, the one whom you love. And so this is the only son that he has. The only son that one thing that he's been waiting for almost 100 years at this point. And God says, I want you to take him to the land of Moriah, to the Mount of Moriah, and offer him as a sacrifice. We can't often, we don't know what the mindset of individuals are, in the Bible when they hear messages or when they, are going through different situations, but it makes you wonder what Abraham's thought process was when he heard, these words, when he was faced with this request, from God, this commandment from God. I wonder what was going through his mind and how he was able to process this, because Abraham, as he always did, something that he always consistently did all throughout his life, when God called to him, what does Abraham do? He says, here I am. And he's going to say that again, here, later on, here in this story. But he always says, when God calls him, he says, here I am. And so God, he is testing it. He calls Abraham, and Abraham always, addresses him respectfully and says, here I am. And that's always a good example for us, as well, because when you read about things that we are called to do in the scriptures, when you read about things that being a New Testament Christian, we are called to do to spread the gospel, to show love, to be the light of the world. When we are called to do all these things, do we say, here I am? Do we say, I'm here, let's get to work, here I am? Or do we say, well, someone else can take care of that, or someone else, can do that, or, I don't think I'm qualified for this. What is our response when we read something that we are called to do, in the scriptures? Abraham said, here I am. And this is a case in which, Abraham doesn't debate this. He doesn't, ask God why here in this case. You think that if I was in that situation, that's probably the first question I would have asked. God, why do you want me to take, my son and offer him, as a sacrifice? Why? Why do you want me, to do that? But Abraham doesn't. He says, here I am. And then God tells him what he wants him to do. And then in verse 3, instead of protesting, look at what Abraham does. It says, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. That's what Abraham does. He doesn't, question God. He doesn't ask anything of God. He just hears what God has to say. And even though it's a, awful thing to think of, he hears what God says, and he goes out immediately and sets his mind to doing it. Abraham was a dedicated follower of God. He was someone who had this. There's a reason why he's in the Hall of Fame of Faith. There's a reason why he's in Hebrews chapter 11, and he's commended for his faith because of his approach to this, and how he was so zoned in, how he was dedicated to doing what God had called him to do. But God does not delight in human sacrifice. God doesn't ask of people in order to do something that is sinful. But this, in this case, was a test. And so Abraham, he gets up and taking his only son. And also, one of the other things that we don't have in the situation is we don't have the words of Sarah. I assume Abraham told Sarah everything that God told him. I mean, I assume he didn't just get up and leave, but I assume he told her all of this. And you wonder maybe what was going through her mind and what she did here on this case. But this was a pretty long journey because they had to travel 3 days. And then it says Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And then he said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And so, and then we get down here to verse 6, and to verse 6 or verse 6. And where the event, takes place, and we'll see Abraham's willingness, to follow through in this. In verse 6, it says, "And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, son.' He said, 'Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself the lamb for burnt offering, my son.' And so they both of them went together. And so we know Abraham didn't tell Isaac what was going on. And Isaac kind of catches on to this, and he says, 'Well, we have fire and we have wood, but where's the sacrifice?' He didn't know that he was going to be the sacrifice here in this case. And you can imagine that probably broke Abraham's heart just a little bit, hearing his son, say that. But he said, the Lord, will provide. And then we get down here to verse 9, when it says, "When they came to the place which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.' And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called the name of that place, 'The Lord will provide,' as it is said to this day, 'On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided.'" And so they make this long journey up to this mountain, to Mount Moriah. And Abraham is there, and he's finally, there's no longer any time to run away or to stall or anything. They have come to the point to where this sacrifice must be made. And so it says, Abraham, he laid all the wood in order, and then he bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar. And we don't get any protest from Isaac either. We don't know that if he trusted in God, if he trusted his father, so much that he wasn't going to protest this either. But he lays him on the altar, and then Abraham, he reaches out his hand and he took the knife to kill his son. And if you've seen pictures that are often drawn or painted about this, oftentimes it's with Abraham with his hand raised just about to to come down before he is stopped. But an angel interrupts him and says, "Abraham, Abraham." And Abraham responds in the same way that he did up in verse 1. If you remember, up in verse 1, when God called to him and asked him to do this very thing, he says, "Here I am." And then down here in verse 11, and when the angel calls to him, he says, "Here I am." For good, or for bad, Abraham always had this response. He said, "Here I am." As we said before, that's a good example, for us. And he says, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now that I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And so Abraham, was tested. As we know from verse 1, this was explicitly, a test. And so Abraham was able to pass, this test because of his, unwavering, trust in that God would provide. Even to the point where he had, the knife in his hand, he still trusted that God, would provide for him. And indeed, God did. And so at that point, God knew that Abraham would never turn away from him. His faith was stronger than uh, definitely stronger than mine, and probably one of the strongest that we read about in the scriptures. But he passes this test, and you can imagine maybe the relief maybe that he had when the angel stopped him, when he called to him and told him to do this. And oftentimes we are called to do some difficult things. Thankfully, I don't think any of us are ever going to be called to sacrifice our son, or even go through the motions of doing that. But there's still some times where we will be called to do some difficult things, and at that time our faith is tested. Sometimes it's put to a to the test, as we might say. It's put through the fire. And so we have to make a decision on what we're going to do when things aren't going so well. It's easy to praise God and to serve God when everything is good and everything is going right. But when things get to where they're not going so good, are we going to be someone who pushes God away then, or are we someone who trusts that He's going to bring us through this trial that we're going through? And Abraham faced some trials in his time, but this was a direct request from God. This God who had provided for him, who had given him this child by miraculous means, asked him to give him away. And he knew that God was going to provide for him. And some people have, posited the theory that in Abraham's mind, even if he did have to kill Isaac, that he believed that God could raise him from the dead, and that He would restore him back. And we don't know, like I said, we don't have an insight into the thought process of Abraham during this time, but he has stopped. And even in some of the hardest, darkest times, Abraham was still faithful in this time. And so trials can often do one of two things. It can either break a faith, or it can harden a faith. It can strengthen a faith, or it can, dissolve it. And so we have to be, careful, like when we're going through these trials, because everybody's going to face obstacles. I'd say a given. If you're going to live in this life, you're going to be a Christian, you're going to face, obstacles. But how you respond to those obstacles is what truly matters when we consider staying faithful and walking on that narrow road. Because as I said before, it's easy to be faithful, in the good times, but it's in the difficult times sometimes it's a little bit more of a challenge. And so if we are someone who says, no matter what, no matter what happens, in this life, I know God is with me, and I'm on His side, then we can push through these things. And even after Isaac was restored to Abraham, I don't think Abraham would look fondly on this memory. I don't think he, would be someone who is going to treasure, this memory. I could be wrong, but this was a tough time for him. But yet, whenever God called him, He said, "Here I am," and he went and did this. And because of this, God would give him a promise, a great promise of what his descendants were going to do. As He said, Isaac would be a great man. Jacob would be a great man. The 12 tribes of Israel would come from him. The nation of Israel would be kind of form up in Egypt. You have people such as Moses and Joshua and Gideon and Samson and Jeremiah and Isaiah, Hezekiah, Jonah, Zephaniah, all these people ultimately leading up to the time of the Gospels when Jesus Himself walks this earth. That great promise that was given to him was because he was a man of faith, and because God would bless him. As He says down here in verse 15, it says, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand of the sea that is on the seashore. and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. That's a promise that was given to Abraham, because of this. And so he certainly was looked favorably upon, by God. And so it's a very inspirational story, a wonderful story to take a look at, in as come the olden times, in the era of the patriarchs, with Abraham and Isaac, and how they shared this, this connection, with God, how God had this conversation, with them, is pretty interesting. And like I said, we could go into a deeper dive here of this chapter and of this story, but I believe we'll probably call it, right there, and maybe pick up some more, later on. But let me know, like I said, in the comments, what the after our video ends, what you thought, of this study, what you thought of, God's request of Abraham. What does it say about Abraham? What does it say about God? What does it say about, the idea of faith, and how faith, plays a role in our life, and how it can be, hardened, or how it can influence the decisions that we make. What do you think, about, this story here in Genesis, chapter 22? But as I said, we'll be back here next week, Thursday night, 7 o'clock, for another episode of the Midweek Bible Study. And I believe, trying to think, I think we have a guest 2 weeks from now, and I don't think we might have one next week, but we'll still, be someone who will dig in, to the Word of God. And so I appreciate you all being here, and I hope that you can go out and be the light of the world and glorify God in everything that you do. Catch you next time.